It's now 12:01. Good afternoon and welcome to all in attendance for this ACC webinar. My name is Karsten Reichel. I'm a partner at DLA Piper, who practices in the areas of white-collar investigations, compliance, and antitrust in Washington, D.C. And I have the honor today of moderating a panel discussion which, as a former government enforcer myself, is near to my own heart and involves navigating the regulatory and enforcement environment in continental Africa as a multinational company. I will introduce you in just a moment to our distinguished group of panelists, who I know you will find to have valuable insights and unique perspective on the topic from a variety of backgrounds. But before I do that, however, a few housekeeping items. First, for those of you who will seek CLE credit for today's session, I will be providing a unique code later in the panel, which you will need to receive credit. Please be ready to make notes so that you can get that credit. Second, as time allows, if you have questions for today's panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box. If we have time remaining at the end, we may be able to address those questions, or we certainly can follow up with you directly after. Finally, a brief introduction and note on our panel. As you no doubt have already discerned from the title, we have undertaken, and deliberately so, a broad topic. And that means that it's both broad in scope and ambition and broad in geography. While we'll discuss some specific regulations and are honored to have an official from one of many regulators and enforcers on the continent, we want for you to take from this panel a bigger picture and receive today's discussion as introductory. We are mindful that you and our audience represent a variety of companies that may be at different points, including just the beginning, with respect to entry into or growth and expansion within continental Africa. One of the themes that we've discussed as panelists in our preparation for today is that of change, and our hope is that you will take from today's webinar useful guidance on how to navigate a regulatory and enforcement environment that has and continues to experience significant change. Now, with that said, let me introduce our esteemed panelists, and I managed the slide change. First, we have with us Dr. Willard Mwemba, who is the Director and Chief Executive Officer of the COMESA Competition Commission, which regulates competition and consumer protection in the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa. He has over 18 years of experience in competition and consumer law enforcement, with wide experience in enforcing competition law at regional and national levels, as well as in the development of competition and consumer protection laws, guidelines, and operational manuals in COMESA member states and beyond. Dr. Mwemba has also held the position of Head of Mergers and Acquisitions Division at the COMESA Competition Commission, and prior to that, he was the Director of Mergers and Monopolies at the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission in Zambia. He serves as a member of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development Competition Training Center for the Middle East and Africa Advisory Board, and currently he's actively involved in the development of competition laws in the Middle Eastern countries. Dr. Mwemba has written extensively and is a guest lecturer on the subject of competition and consumer laws at various universities in Africa and beyond. He holds several qualifications, including bachelor's degrees with specialization in law and economics from the University of Zambia, a master's degree in European competition law, and King's College London, and a PhD in competition law from the University of Cape Town. And if I might add a personal note, he is a friend of mine from my own days, and I was privileged to work with him when I was at the United States Department of Justice. So welcome, Dr. Mwemba. Next.
Thank you very much, Karsten. Thank you for those warm words.
Next, we have equally distinguished Mpumi Mazibuko. Mpumi holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Cape Town, a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of South Africa, and postgraduate diplomas in corporate law from the University of Johannesburg. He has also obtained Group 1 qualification from the South Africa Institute of Intellectual Property. Mpumi served and completed his articles of clerkship in 2005 at DM Kitch, Inc., a firm focusing on intellectual property and commercial litigation matters. He was subsequently employed as an associate at the corporate law firm Weber Wenzel Bowens. In 2007, Mpumi joined Spoor and Fisher, where he was involved in general trademark matters, copyright law, unlawful competition and commercial litigation matters, and those involving intellectual property. 2009 and 2010, Mpumi was seconded to the 2010 FIFA World Cup as a legal manager for the Rights Protection Program based in South Africa and working in Zurich, Switzerland. On his return to Spoor and Fisher, Mpumi continued to practice in the areas of trademark and copyright litigation and the commercialization of intellectual property as a senior associate. In 2012, he joined Coca Cola Africa Limited as operations legal counsel, and that was followed by various other roles and responsibilities within the Southern, Eastern, and Central Africa Business Unit legal function. He currently is the General Counsel for the Africa Operating Unit and is based in the Johannesburg, South Africa office of Coca Cola. Welcome, Mpumi.
Thank you, Carsten. Good to be here.
Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Khalidou Gadio, who is the co-chair of DLA Piper's U.S. Africa practice and is based here with me in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. His practice focuses on strategic and economic development projects involving energy, natural resources, and infrastructure. He represents developers, construction companies, financiers, and sovereign states on financing structure, risk allocation, and financing arrangements and relevant security packages. Khalidou brings deep knowledge of sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA regions, having previously spent 27 years at the African Development Bank, including 8 years as General Counsel at the ADB. During his tenure there, he played a critical role in creating Africa 50, an investment bank for continental Africa with a slated capital of $3 billion United States, and setting up the African Legal Support Facility, which provides legal and capacity building services for African governments negotiating major commercial and infrastructure contracts. His notable experience also includes restructuring Shelter Afrique into a full DFI, advising TDB on its corporate governance, as well as several transactions related to Islamic finance, advising Badia on its capital markets private placement, advising Africa Re on its restructuring counseling out African governments in legislative reforms, institutional capacity building, and advising sovereign corporations, private enterprises, and public-private partnerships on project finance transactions. Khalidou hails from Mauritania and speaks English, French, and Fulani. With that said, let's get into...
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to take my screen down. And let me begin with one way in which Africa differs. And if I can ask Dr. Mwemba, for our U.S. audience, the concept, you're with a regional enforcer, and the concept of a regional enforcer is probably new to several in the audience today. Can you, at the beginning, explain what COMESA is and how it interacts with national authorities?
Thank you very much, Karsten. Thank you very much, dear listeners. So without further ado, I think I'll get straight to the topic. COMESA stands for the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. So basically, this is a group of countries that have come together to ensure that their markets are integrated, and they call it one market that is not separated by physical boundaries and barriers like borders. Now, the name COMESA itself, Karsten, is misleading because it doesn't only include Southern and Eastern African countries, but includes Northern African countries, Southern African countries, Eastern African countries, and Indian Ocean Island countries. So it's quite a big group of countries, 21 in total, with a geographical space of 12 million square kilometers, a population of 640 million people, and indeed a GDP of about $1 trillion. So when you look at the population there, it gives countries and also businesses, whether COMESA businesses, African businesses, or global businesses, it offers them a wide market for their goods and services, as opposed to a single country, which would have 10 million people, 20 million people. So it creates this very big market of 640 million people. Now, COMESA has established institutions to ensure that it achieves the mandate, it achieves the objective of full market integration. All these 21 member states being called one market without any barriers, without any boundaries. So it has created a number of institutions, and one of them is the COMESA Competition Commission. So the COMESA Competition Commission is a regional competition authority with the mandate of promoting and encouraging competition among business players by preventing restrictive business practices and other restrictions that deter the efficient operation of markets, and also to protect consumers from offensive conduct by market actors. Now, for purposes of this audience, for purposes of this webinar, I think it is very important to appreciate that the reason why COMESA is there is not simply to ensure that we are promoting and protecting the process of competition for the sake of. The reason is to ensure that we attract investments into this common market, because investors are more comfortable when they know that when there's anti-competitive conduct, when they know that when there are an orthodox kind of conduct and behavior by other market players that may make it difficult for them to either enter that market or grow in that market, they will have a trusted institution where they will go to and present their case to ensure that the operations of that market are very smooth. So it is very, very important, and it's very, very important for American listeners and especially businesses that this institution is created actually to ensure that it facilitates business, to ensure that it facilitates trade and not frustrating trade. So we want to create an environment where all businesses will compete on innovation and not on an orthodox conduct. We'll compete on business ideas, legitimate one, and not those that are illegitimate. So as a result, we encourage investments, and we are hopeful that our American listeners today who have not had an opportunity of knowing what the COMESA Competition Commission is, and they've been thinking of investing in Africa, that you are welcome, your investment will be safeguarded, any anti-competitive conduct against you will be rooted out as long as the COMESA Competition Commission is made aware of. Thank you so much, Casting.
Thank you. And Mpumi, I'm going to ask you, from your position in leadership in a multinational company, would you add anything to what Dr. Mwemba said? And specifically, how do you think and how do you have to adjust your business to deal with this sort of multi-tiered regional and national level of authorities?
Carsten, thank you. And also thank you to your audience for allowing us the opportunity to engage. One critical factor that I think Dr. Mwemba summed up was the purpose of COMESA, a regional body that is meant to enable trade and to facilitate economic growth. I think that for me is quite critical. And coming from a multinational perspective, I think it's, we need to appreciate what the role of a multinational will be in this sort of environment. And, I must preface this by also saying that the concept of a COMESA is not something that is necessarily new or unique to the continent. You also have the Southern African Development Corporation, you have the East Africa Corporation. So you have these bodies, these regional bodies that have been set up over a number of years, and they have a common purpose and objective, which is to really unlock and free up that space for economic activity. Now, a crucial factor here is the role that any corporation, whether it be a local national corporation or a multinational, should be playing in that space. And for me, it's critical that entities like this get to appreciate and understand the tensions that are at play between the regulator, them as a corporate entity, and also the broader public, civil society. The way that I look at it is each of us has a role to play in this, and it's critical to appreciate what the common goal is. And the common goal is to have an impact on the socio-economic life of a particular country or a particular region. So from a multi-net perspective, it's critical to appreciate that the influence that an entity has in a country's lifeblood, in a country's purpose, can have fundamental ramifications. And you need to have those clear perimeters and clear boundaries set. But those don't necessarily need to be restrictive. And it's crucial for multinets to appreciate that regulators do this to look after, yes, the interests of the people in the country, the citizens, but to also create a level of investment from that multinet to make sure that they are invested in a way that is not only about the bottom line, that is also addressing social issues like skills transfer, being able to inculcate a sense of purpose, not only for the multinet, but for those that work for that sort of entity. Hope that helps, Carsten.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Let me bring Khalidou in. Khalidou, you have worked, particularly in your work at the African Development Bank, for many years with investors in Africa. And we hear Mpumi and Dr. Mwemba talking about things like investor comfort and creating trusted institutions that can facilitate business. I want to ask you, from your experience both at the ADB and now working with clients, what are businesses and what are investors on the continent looking for when it comes to their consideration of the regulatory and enforcement environment that they're entering?
Well, thank you, Carlson. I think both my predecessors just made it quite easy for me. I thought though our friend Musimpumi would have mentioned it, but oftentimes when you meet investors in a fora or in a particular meeting, they always talk about rule of law. And that's some to the point where most of Africans get actually annoyed by hearing, and in every conference, in every fora, in it, oh, there's no rule of law in Africa. And generally, what they mean by that, they mean that whether in a particular country in which they intend to invest, there is a clear set of rules that they know in advance. I mean, that's basically you would say, but it's not always clear. Because even in the case of COMESA, I think it was pointed out that some of the member countries have not implemented some of the rules. So you can see the disparity between the countries. Some have full-fledged complied with the regulation. Some are not complied with the regulation yet. So that's first thing that I think is very important for international investors. They want to know what are the rules of the game. And most importantly, once they know the rule, they also would like to know whether you can enforce actually those rights. I mean, if they sign a contract, they want to know if indeed something goes wrong, and we know things go wrong. So they want to know if they are able, in fact, to take the matter to the court, which is independent. And also they would like to know whether actually they can have a decision within a reasonable time. Because one of the things also you see in Africa is that courts are overloaded. So you can lodge a complaint and wait for months and months, if not years, before you get a decision. So that obviously is a chilling effect for investors. I mean, it's not necessarily unique to Africa, but clearly in Africa, it's one of the problems. It's a matter of resources. It's a matter of organizations. So they want to have the rules that are clear. They want to be able to enforce the contract within a reasonable period of time. But also, they would like to know whether there is generally no interference in the judicial process. I mean, obviously, they don't want to feel like if they go after certain contractors, they're going to have a problem with some people. I mean, obviously, that's very important, meaning that whoever you are, in the end, the law will prevail. So that's the third element. And of course, they are looking also at what is generally called political stability, because obviously in several African countries, you have from time to time some coups. And in the occasion of coups, new government generally tend to revisit some contract, not all of the contracts. So these are the 4 points I would mention that are really critical in the eyes of investors. They want to have clear rules. They want to have enforcement with the independent judiciary within a reasonable time. They don't want to have interference with the process, and they want to have some level of stability that give them comfort.
That's really helpful. And sticking with you, Khalidou, you and I were speaking yesterday, and then we'll bring Mapumi in, who's got his hand raised. Can you give an example? I mean, you were talking about some examples where you thought it worked better than others, and talking about examples perhaps in the Francophone companies about kind of practically how things have kind of developed and happened in a way that you thought was helpful. I'm going to ask you and then go to Mapumi for his intervention. But if you could give us that example, I thought that would be really
I mean, there are probably several examples where it has worked. But one example for foreigners, for instance, is the case called OHADA. It looks Japanese, but it is in fact an acronym of in French. It's an organization in which about, I don't know, don't hold me to it, more than 10 countries that use civil law system have decided to harmonize. It's not to make it actually compatible, but it's a step above. It is harmonized, meaning it is exactly, if you go to Cote d'Ivoire, The corporate law is the same as in Togo, as in Senegal, as in Mali, as in Burkina, and so. Not only the text of the law is the same, but if you have an issue in terms of enforcement, you have a common court, which ultimately serves as a court of appeal or the Supreme Court. So you have a sense here of security that I was mentioning. So you have the same law, and that law is interpreted and understood in the same manner. And if there is a divergence, for instance, if you can take your case in Senegal, you have a dispute, go all the way to the Senegalese Supreme Court. You can still go to the Ohada Supreme Court, which has the power to overrule the decision or at least to make a case. So this is a good example. There are some other good examples in Africa, but in terms of harmonization, so I think this is one of the most complete example of, and it gives a lot of assurance to the company in terms of really reliability and confidence in the law. Thank you.
That's really helpful. And Mpumi, let me hear from you now.
Carsten, thank you. And my panelist, made a very good point around what is critical when a multinet goes into a jurisdiction and really wants to have sustainable material investment. And the rule of law is definitely, I think, top of mind. It is something critical to have that certainty that if there are issues in dispute, that they will be adjudicated in a fair and equitable manner according to the dictates of justice, that you'll be able to make proper representations, that you'll be afforded the necessary avenues for appeal or for review. But I think, even beyond that, it goes back to the point that I made around having a socio-economic impact in the region that you're in. I think one critical thing that investors need to realize is that states are becoming more interventionist in Africa. And there's a reason for that. The reason is governments have become emboldened, and they realize that they need to build their own internal structures, their own internal infrastructure, and create an environment that is really beneficial for citizens. And this, has a lot of history in post-colonial development, and the realization that some of the gains that came from, liberation and all of that have not necessarily materialized into material gains for the people. And some entities that are embedded in those countries have not necessarily contributed in a way which is constructive. So states have become more interventionist, particularly, I would argue, post-pandemic era. There's a realization that value chains and supply chains need to be effective, need to be optimized, need to be controlled. And for any entity that is going to be invested in a country that has an interventionist state, they need to realize what's expected of them in terms of the rules and regulations of the country. But those also need to be fair and equitable to a corporate citizen. So there's a lot of responsibility, I would argue, from all quarters. And it brings me back to my point that you need to have what we refer to as a social compact. Social compact between corporate citizens, between governments, civil society, and one that has an objective of either growing a country or the region that's concerned. And all of this, for me, is premised on understanding what each role player's contribution is going to be towards all of this. And it all involves, in my perspective, certainty about policies that also translates into the rule of law. And that concept is a very, right now, it's a very contentious one. And I think my colleague alluded to it when he talked about the recent coups that have been happening across the continent. And it's also a question of the rule of law according to whose standards. So, that is a dynamic that we can also explore. But there's a really fertile debate to be had around the concept of the rule of law and what it means for multinationals and their roles and responsibilities.
And I want to go to Dr. Wimmer in a second, but I want to follow with one question for you, Mpumi. Look, you represent Coca Cola. It's a big global. It is a business force that is recognized around the globe. What are some of the things that you think about from a multinational perspective about how you can contribute to this? You talk about building that social compact. What's the role of a company like Coca Cola that in a lot of cases has more resources, has more cachet, whatever we want to think about, that is often a first mover into some of these markets.
Good question.
What are some of the things that you think about in terms of how to build in your role in the social compact?
Yeah, look, Carsten, I think you raised a very good question. What is the role of an entity like a Coca Cola? And for me, in the years that I've been a lawyer, a business partner for our enterprise, one thing I've realized is that, there's a company needs to have a sense of purpose in the jurisdiction that it operates in. It's more than just about pushing services or a product into a market. It's realizing that you have a profound responsibility, especially if you're a brand like ours that is very omnipresent. And for me, it's about earning the social license to operate. You simply can't go into communities, set up business, and reap profits and repatriate them to your home country. That can't be the situation. There needs to be a level of investment that goes beyond just setting up a greenfield, setting up operations and infrastructure. You need, I would argue, to really be invested in the welfare of the people. And that involves giving back to the community in a way that is material and that is not tokenism. So let me give you an example. We have a project that we partner with called One Last Mile. Coca Cola is very astute at establishing logistics infrastructures in the regions where we operate in, getting our product from the factory into the market. And it's quite a intricate web of infrastructure we have. And one of the issues and problems we have in Southern Africa is malaria. And in the southern eastern part of our continent, in Mozambique specifically, we partnered with an entity that used our cold storage facilities to actually transport medication into some of the regions that were very difficult for government entities and for non-governmental entities to get into. And we're very effective in partnering with NGOs and with government because of our infrastructure, because of our level of investment in that region. And that's what I mean by realizing what your role in the compact is. The role of a multinet that has influence, I would argue, is to build that goodwill with society and to really go above and beyond what it is that you're doing in terms of your core business. Hope that helps, Carsten.
Yeah, no, it really does. That's a great perspective to share. And Dr. Wimble, you've had your hand up for a while. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to you to make your responsive point. But then I also want to ask you, obviously, Kalidou brought up a really interesting concept about that idea of harmonization. I know that's something that is critical for you and your thinking and the thinking at COMESA about how to bring that harmony across laws along the lines of what he discussed. And then just turn the floor over to you to talk about one of the bigger things that we've talked about, doing that in an environment where changes are being made and changes are happening, because I know COMESA has a lot of changes in the works on their own regulatory scheme. So that's a lot of ground for you to cover, but I'm going to turn it over to you and give you the floor now to address those things.
Thank you so much, Carsten. And it's like you are reading my mind, because I wanted to react to certain issues that Mpumi has raised, but also the issue of certainty, rule of law, and the harmonization that Kalidou also raised. So I think I'll start with Mpumi. Mpumi, you raise a very, very important issue and give a very positive picture of what a multinet can do in the society that it is operating in. And that is not only looking for opportunities to come and invest in that society and reap the profits without any benefit to that society. So that picture you present is a very important picture that most investors should be able to give as an assurance to the environments in which they exist. Now, that brings me to the next issue: how an institution like mine that is responsible for antitrust regulation, how do we interface and how do we ensure that this relationship between a regulator like myself and a businessman like yourself work together to ensure that, one, there's lots of mistrust between the regulators and society and businesses. On one hand, the regulators always think businesses are engaging in certain underhand methods by exploiting consumers by excluding other competitors so that they just reap the profits to themselves without benefiting anyone. So there's already that mistrust. Companies also have that mistrust for regulators, thinking regulators are only there to fine them, make money out of them for their operations, make the cost of business very high. They don't understand the rationale why the businesses, competition authorities or other regulators are doing what they are doing. So that mistrust also is not good for the business environment. So I'm so happy and appreciate the issue that Mpumi is raising, that when multinationals come in the society, they come there not always with bad intentions, but with good intentions. And there's need for us to develop this trust and not this mistrust amongst ourselves. And we can do that in Mpumi by ensuring that we are engaging more. For example, I'll come to the issue that Carsten has just raised in a while, that COMESA is reviewing its law, and a number of issues will come out in that law that will have implications for businesses. My idea is that once the law is passed, I think in December, not later than December, once the law is passed early next year, I'm convening a meeting for business. I'll invite all businesses that are known, the Coca Colas of this world, the Googles, the Facebooks, and to have a meeting where we will be telling them the new provisions of the law and the consequences or ramifications for them. Already in that process, some trust is being built. In that process, some levels of cooperation between competition authorities and businesses is being developed. It is in that process where you come up even with things like compliance programs and the like, because sometimes businesses do not break laws with the intention of breaking laws. Sometimes they break laws because they are not aware, because we've not done a good job in sensitizing. So I wanted to speak to that. Then let me get to Khalidou. Khalidou raises a very important issue of certainty and harmonization, especially in OHADA. Carsten, I want to give assurance to your participants here, our listeners to this webinar, that it's not always the case that in Africa, I think sometimes that is a picture that is painted, that it's a jungle kind of arrangement. There are no laws, people do whatever they want to do. I don't think it's very true. In fact, Khalidou, we should be patting ourselves on our backs, because the OHADA thing that you mentioned, it's not every continent really that has more than 55 countries, or about 55 countries as Africa has. It's very, very difficult really to harmonize. Most countries, this doesn't happen. Even in Asia, they'll have different laws for different countries, different. In Africa, and the OHADA that is raising, before I come to COMESA, we've attempted to have certain regions and certain groups of countries really that have harmonized their laws, and it becomes very easy for a businessman, because once they are dealing with one member of that group, one country is a member of that group, a similar law will apply. So to me, OHADA is a very important example, a good example that we can sell to our colleagues outside Africa, American investors, for purposes of this webinar, that there's actually a set of civilized rules even in Africa that can easily facilitate business, and that you don't have to deal with different sets of rules in different countries. You don't have to engage different kinds of lawyers and pay them heavy amounts of money to meet different requirements in different countries. And as I say this, I come now to the COMESA Competition Commission. While in OHADA, Khalid spoke about harmonization, that they have similar provisions in their laws. In COMESA, in fact, we have one law for competition, one law for antitrust. So as long as for example, one way in which companies and multinationals invest in a certain region is through mergers and acquisitions, takeovers, and things like that. And in COMESA, we are saying if you are engaged in such a transactions, or in such an investment through a merger, through a takeover, through an acquisition, and it involves 2 or more of these 21 countries in Africa, if it simply involves 2 or more, only one law will be used. Previously, Carsten, before this law was born, if you are Coca Cola, and I'll mention Coca Cola because I've been dealing with Coca Cola, they've been making a number of investments through such transactions in Africa. So I've been dealing with them since the early 2000s, before the COMESA law came into effect. Coca Cola would come to Zambia. They do the notification requirements. There are different notification fees, different requirements of compliance. They would go to Zimbabwe, do the same thing, go to different countries. It was burdensome, it was cumbersome, it was costly, and not costly just in terms of the amounts of money that they are paying to the regulators, but costly in terms of the amounts of money that they are paying to representatives, legal representatives, to go into all these different countries. COMESA law was born, and I'll assure you today that this COMESA law is one law that will apply as long as your investment affects 2 or more of these countries. Only that one law will apply. Coca Cola, where Mpumi is coming from, is one of those companies that has benefited from this law when they were engaging in the setup of the, I think they call it the Coca Cola CCBA, something like that, Africa Beverage Company or something like that. Coca Cola Africa
yes.
Beverage Company, CCBA. Yes, I dealt with them at COMESA. I was the head of the measures department then. They came to COMESA. Coca-Cola can attest that they never went to all the 21 member states of COMESA. And the 21 member states of COMESA, Coca-Cola is big. They do operate in all those countries. But because of that law, they only had to come to us, and it reduced their administrative inconvenience, their costs of doing business, and the like. So it is very, very important. I think we give assurance to investors that it's not always a gloomy picture. In Africa, a scary place to invest in, but there are all these positive stories. And one of the participants, my good friend Mpumi here, the company he works for, can attest that they've actually used that law to the exclusion of all other national laws in those countries where they operate. And now coming to the issues, Carsten, you gave me a lot because now I've just finished with my own thoughts. I'm coming to your issue now. Coming to the issue that Carsten raised. As I spoke earlier, or as I said earlier, I said the mandate of the Commission is to ensure that it promotes and protects or encourages competition in this common market of 21 countries. And one way it does that is the review of mergers and acquisitions, but also the prohibition of anti-competitive conduct, those exclusionary conduct or practices by businesses to exclude others. Currently, as I'm speaking, and that's why maybe I joined in a little late, I was in a COMESA subcommittee on legal drafting, because we are changing the law and making it more progressive. What are some of the salient issues that are coming out of that? There are so many of them, but in the interest of time and for purposes of this meeting, I'll mention just a few, maybe 1, 2, or 3. One of them, Carsten, is that the COMESA Competition Commission now, what it is doing is that previously, in mergers and acquisitions, the practice was that it was non-suspensory. So you could notify a merger if you have operations in all these countries. I spoke about 2 of them. And then you did not need to wait. You would proceed, and by the time the Commission is issuing a decision, you could have already implemented the merger. The danger with that was that it created uncertainty on the companies. It created a lot of uncertainties, because if the Commission then came and said, we do not approve of this merger, companies needed to reverse that merger. Which was serious uncertainty. So now we are saying, once you notify, you have to wait for some period, and until the commission issues its decision. So as you are implementing, Carsten, you are very sure of what the decision is. The next issue as regards mergers that we have brought in there is that for digital mergers or mergers in the digital space, it was very difficult to capture them using the conventional turnover or asset levels that they derive in a certain country, because usually they do not have assets sometimes in certain countries. So it was becoming cumbersome. Every little merger, the Commission would go to those companies, knock on their doors, hey, can you notify? Then they tell us, no, you don't have assets in COMESA. We are making it very certain for them as well, that it should be certain that if it reaches a certain transaction value, they would know that this is notifiable. If it is of lesser than that transaction value, they know COMESA Competition Commission would not be knocking on their doors. They'll self-assess and simply proceed with the implementation of that transaction. Carsten, the last one that I may want to bring to your attention here is that in merger transactions now, we shall be allowing companies that are merging to proceed, even if the merger is likely to result in a monopoly, if they can demonstrate, given the times we are living in, if they can demonstrate that their merger will result in benefits to the environment or sustainable considerations and benefits to the society. And that's why I liked what Mpumi said, because some of those are the benefits we can talk about. There is disease in one part of the country or one part of the world. This company says, look, when we enter, even this, we can use our cold storage facilities to transport vaccines there. That should be one of the justifications a company can now use to say, let our merger proceed. It's quite a number of things to talk about, Karsten, and I know we are still here, time permitting, I'll come in, but those are some of the things to look for. And I'm sure when we hold that meeting that we'll hold early next year, most companies will participate that so that they can get a number of other issues that we are changing. For now, maybe let me leave the floor. I saw Khalidu had his hand up. Maybe he has something to say as well.
I think if I can just interrupt and exercise my prerogative as a moderator here, I'm going to give you that code now that I promised at the beginning, and then we'll go to Khalidu. The code for those of you seeking CLE credit should be on your screen now. If you cannot see it, it is 55381. And I will get that share up there for just a few seconds. Again, the CLE code is 55381. So with that out of place intervention, I'm going to stop the sharing and go back to Khalidu, who has been very patient indeed since raising your hand. And Khalidu, I invite you to respond however you had initially thought about it, and then we'll get to Mpumi. But bringing you back into the conversation, you early expressed these ideas about certainty. When an organization, and I don't want to preclude your other response, but obviously, Dr. Mwemba is talking about a lot of changes that are coming up, and I certainly know that he's only scratched the surface, as we'll do on this panel. But what do investors look at, and how do they get comfortable with the ability of these changes to come in fact and actually make the environment, make the geography more attractive for investment? So let me give you a chance to respond however you want, but ask what your reaction is from an investor standpoint when you hear about changes in the law like what Dr. Mwemba has described.
Actually, I'm actually very pleased to see Mr. Mpumi says what he said, because that's not typically what you hear from a foreign investor. And perhaps maybe he's African. He has because I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, the foreign company that come to Africa and looking for business, they're not going to talk to you about social contracts. I mean, that's what they should do, and I think what he said is excellent. But that's not what usually you hear. What you hear is more the perception of risk. They're talking about the risk, and that risk of also the stability of the law, risk of political risk, consistency, and enforcement of the judicial. But I would agree. I mean, I think the world, Africa, would be better if everybody thought like Mr. Mpumi, but unfortunately that is not the case, and that's the reality. And that's why if you look at the number of litigation that taking place in Africa, you will see that the investors have not always looked for or tried to achieve that social contract that he so eloquently described. And we salute Coca Cola for having people like himself and who have that in mind. And I think it would be great if all the big companies would have such approach to investment. So the other problem, and here I have a bad role talking about as an investor. I'm an African, so I'm just telling what I have been hearing the last 35 years from them. That perception of risk is oftentimes also exaggerated for Africans, although you hear it all the time. This is risky because we have a small market. It is risky because, as was pointed out again by William, that the market, there's no exchange between Tanzania and Kenya. So you have a lot of regulation. So in short, what I would like to draw here is that yes, it is important for Africa to come up with these initiative like the common market. I think it is fantastic, but just have to be cautious and not to be also too ambitious, because obviously if you have one competition law for almost like 10 countries that still, and I stand to be corrected, have their own national competition law, you may possibly create a conflict of laws. You may possibly create a confusion as to, I mean, obviously the text says the treaty has a higher value than national law, but in reality, we know what it is. I mean, if you go to Egypt and you want to impose the common market, the competition law over Egyptian contractors, they are powerful institutions in the construction business. Equally in Kenya, you have big banks that, including Egypt or South Africa, have like incredible financial institutions, other companies, and you would tend to see some level of protection from the government of the national companies. So you have to be worried about that. And the objective is good, especially if you have a group that have countries that are so disparate. For instance, between Egypt and Burundi, between South Africa and, I don't know, even DRC, between South Africa and Mozambique. They're so different at the level of development to put them all under the same rule is ambitious. It's a fantastic idea if it is achievable, but there are embedded risk in doing that, because and then the level of rule of law is not the same. I mean, I'm not going to mention which one is better than the other, but clearly when you look at the COMESA member countries, they are not at the same level. Some of them are more protective than the others. Some of them are more liberal than the others. Some of them are even much more closed. I mean, you don't need me to tell you, some of those countries are extremely rigid in the manner in which they view business. They won't necessarily allow a lot of free competition or even free enterprise, let alone free competition. So just a word of caution. To be ambitious, it's important, but to proceed incrementally so that investors will see it in a manner that is very, very, very positive. And I know we run out of time. I'll stop here.
Let me, in the interest of time, let's keep it moving. But Mpumi, why don't I take it to you and get your response here, and we'll go from there.
Carsten, look, thank you very much. And I must really give my panelists credit for really fueling the debate and the discussion here. Just quick 2 points from my side. Harmonization. The points that Dr. Mwemba made, very critical, crucial points for where we are as a continent right now. And I go back to the comments I made earlier about the world having opened up post-pandemic. We realize that we need to be in control of our own destiny, of the value chain and the supply chain of goods and services. And I think, people underestimate the trajectory that African governments, African entities are on. And this is really, for me, is punctuated by the Africa Continental Trade Agreement. And I would urge your audience to really read up on this, find out about it, because I would argue it's going to be one of the seismic events in terms of creating a sense of modernization for Africa. The Africa Free Trade Agreement actually accentuates what COMESA is doing. And I would argue that it is a logical step to breaking down these artificial barriers and allowing for commercial trade, for intercultural trade even, to happen and happen in a way that is reasoned and rational. It's still at a very nascent stage right now, but we've had so many experiments globally. I think we can leapfrog some of the errors and issues that other jurisdictions have experienced and really implement something that is sustainable. The second point is around the comment that Khaladu made, which is a very relevant one, risk. As a commercial entity, you obviously want to generate a profit. But the days of just simply creating something for the bottom line that is of value to the shareholder, that is being redefined, that has changed. And for an entity to do business, I would argue in any jurisdiction, you need to understand what the local nuances are and to really embed yourself in generating profit, not only for yourself, but for that area, for that jurisdiction that you operate in a way, obviously, that is ethical, in a way that has moral responsibility. So I think the responsibility on multinets, any entity for that matter, has become more heightened and is being redefined as we speak. I just wanted to make those two quick comments.
Yep. And before I go back to Dr. Mwemba, I want to invite you or ask you to make a third point, or at least address a third point. So Dr. Mwemba talked about the process that COMESA is going through and changing its regulations, and then the promulgation of guidelines. So I know well from my former time that guidelines are not the law. Guidelines are not the rules. They are an agency or an enforcer's or regulator's interpretation of the rules. And you've heard in this, his earlier remarks, an invitation for companies like Coca Cola to come and weigh in on the guidelines and the guidance. What is your reaction to, how does a company like Coca Cola view guidelines? So we're talking about changed rules. We have a separate issue, and I want to close with it. And so I'll preview my next question about enforcement. But guidelines kind of exist between enforcement and regulation. And I want to get your reaction to the utility and role of guidelines from regulators and enforcers.
Good question, Carsten. And look, my perspective, my view on it is this, that the law can be a very fluid concept. Yes, there needs to be certainty, but the law is a human construct and it changes over time. And our approach has been to really engage with regulators, engage in a constructive way, because we want to have a sustainable business wherever we operate. And I'm glad that Dr. Mwemba extended that invite. We'll take him up on it, and hopefully he'll pick up the tab for all of us. So there needs to be a level of engagement between regulators and multinational corporates that is constructive. And it will really call on us also having an influence on what those guidelines look like. But, I'm hoping that that influence, that input will be taken on in a way that is positive and in a spirit of positivity, because we're also learning here. We need to understand what the purpose and the objectives of the regulators are, and they also need to appreciate and understand what our businesses are about. And there you can find a healthy medium that parties can agree on. And that's what it's about. This has to be a negotiation. And in a negotiation, there will be compromises made. There will be trade-offs made. So my perspective, Carsten, in brief, is that, yes, that engagement needs to happen. And now it's a new dawn for that sort of constructive engagement to start happening and to really pull back from that trust deficit that I acknowledge has always been there. But we are starting to see signs of that trust deficit being broken down.
Thank you. And I think what will ultimately be our last intervention here, he has been very patient and is entitled to a response or a clarification for Dr. Mwemba. So I want to invite you, Dr. Mwemba, with the last 5 minutes or so here before we have to close, to both say your reaction to the remarks from Khalidou and Mpumi, but I also want to ask you about that last piece, because this panel is about regulatory and enforcement environment. And so when an organization like COMESA changes the regulations, there's also that second piece. It's one thing to have, and Khalidou made this point, to have it written down on paper, to have guidelines even put it, but then there's a question of enforcement. So what is, in addition to your responses, I want to ask you what COMESA is doing and how COMESA views its role and its member states' role and in enforcement. So new regulations are going to be on. What's the enforcement then going to look like, and how is COMESA getting ready for that very kind of actionable piece of it? So floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carsten, and privileged to be the last speaker. I'll begin. The question that you raised, actually, I wanted to address that in reaction to one issue that Khalidou raised. But let me start with Mpumi. The issue, my brother, that you raised on trust between regulators and businesses, I think to me is at the core of my heart. That is the beginning of effective enforcement. When there's trust, when the competition authority or any other regulator is not always thinking business has something to hide. When the business is not always thinking these guys, it's, I don't know if you watch the James Bond 007 series. That is an 007 kind of issues that catch me if you can. So if there's that trust, I think enforcement becomes very easy. If companies are found on the wrong side of the law, they easily comply because they know that the competition authority is doing the right thing. There's competence, the law is certain, and things like that. So that is why, Kirsten, in our case, even as the law that we are now discussing at the legal drafting committee, when we produced the first draft, we invited the whole world to make comments to that law. And the whole world made comments to that law, not just regulators, not just national competition authorities, but businesses also. I remember receiving volumes of submissions from Google, volumes of submissions from Safaricom in Kenya, volumes of submissions from the East Africa Business Society. And when we finally had the document for validation, I was so surprised and encouraged because in that validation meeting, I saw business representatives. So, and this is a thing I've always been talking and saying, the concern I have with the AFCFTA. I'm part of the negotiation and the drafting of those AFCFTA, especially the competition protocol. The thing that I unfortunately have not liked there is that it is only us lawyers and economists from government institutions that are meeting to draft that law, but those who will be subject to that law, the businesses, are not part of the conversation. Therein lies the problem. Transparency is very important. Trust is very important. So COMESA, Kirsten, what it has done from the word go, it posted its law in public and called for comments, and not just comments for the sake of saying, yes, we posted for comments, ensured that we put those comments or we took them into account during the validation, physical validation. Companies, law firms, national competition authorities, other government institutions, we convened in one place to go through that law. So from the beginning, it is a law that business will trust because they already had an input into that. Coming to Khalidou. Khalidou, I just wanted to ask a question, and you don't have to answer it now. You said we should be a little bit careful. We should be take some caution when we are coming up with these common markets and single laws, because countries have different levels of development and they've got their own different dynamics. Don't you think that is more reason, if we have to give certainty to investors, that is more reason why we should actually have one single law, as long as those countries are complying, because then there will be no uncertainty to say, well, in Zambia, this is what happens. In Mozambique, we are not so sure if there is certainty. Don't you think having that one law, as long as all those countries are complying, is a step in the right direction or a better risk than not having it and having to comply with all these uncertainties? Surely, I think that would be the step in the right direction. And now that leads me to Kirsten, when he says it is not now just about coming with the law and guidelines, enforceability, and how do we ensure that all the countries are complying with that? Kirsten, for us in COMESA, I don't know if it has been some stroke of luck or there's something good that we've done. I'll assure you, and that's why I gave an example of Coca Cola, because I'm happy Mpumi is here, so he knows I'm not lying. It's something that is true. All countries, as it relates to competition law, antitrust law in COMESA, all countries have complied and submitted to the jurisdiction of the commission. That I can assure you for a fact, 100%. I can assure you attendees here that when they come to invest in COMESA and their conduct involves 1, 2 or more countries, they will definitely just deal with our law. So that the last 11 years, that's what has happened. What we are doing now is not new. We are just improving the law that we've been implementing. So nothing new, it's just an improvement. However, finally, Kirsten, to ensure that your question is addressed, we have made very specific provisions in the law on the consequences on those countries that may not comply or submit to the jurisdiction of the COMESA Competition Commission. We've never had that problem, but we have put it expressly in the law, the consequences for those countries that would be frustrating business by allowing businesses to be doing parallel processes in their countries. And we hope that will work well. Kirsten, please allow me, I know we are running out of time. One thing we have done to make sure that that happens Just like I spoke about business, even on member states and national competition authorities, we've had so many sensitization and awareness programs where we've sat down to tell them the benefits of this system, and we think that is why it has worked very well. I assure you, Kalidu, read so much about COMESA, go to our website, you'll see the marvelous work that we are doing there, and all 21 countries are complying and submitting to that. Thank you very much. Karsten, please let us hold that workshop, and I hope you also be there. I think there'll be a lot to talk about.
I think there will be, as there's been much more that we could talk about today. We have reached the top of the hour, a little bit over. Thanks to our audience. We hope this has been, for you, a valuable session to give a little bit of an introduction and a variety of perspectives, both from the in-house perspective, from the government enforcement and regulation perspective, and from the investment perspective about what we want to see and hope to see, and what we're beginning to see more and more of. What positive themes. Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists. Harmony, certainty, these are values I think we can all share. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon and evening.
Thank you, Karsten. Thank you, Dr. Mwemba Kalidu.
Thank you so much, colleagues. It was a pleasure being on the same panel with you today. Bye-bye.
Take care.